do you say we kick it off here? My name is Dave Reese, and I'm here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. We want to thank you for joining us here today. And on behalf of Mr. Mike Swetnam, our CEO, and General Al Gray, the chairman of our Board of Regents, it's a pleasure to have you all here. This is our 6th series that we've dealt with the cyber, and this one we're going to talk about cybersecurity policy. Where are we, and where do we need to be? And that reminds me of something that happened on the way in this morning. I was driving through the back roads getting into work, and all of a sudden, the largest frog I ever saw hopped in front of my car. And I veered out of the way, put on my brakes, put down my window, looked down at the frog, and the frog looked up and said, "Thanks for not hitting me." And I went, "It's the first time I've ever seen a talking frog." He said, "Because you didn't hit me, I'm going to grant you one wish." Being a Marine and wanting peace on Earth, I said, "Can we have peace in the Middle East, please?" And that frog looked at me. He said, "You know, people have been trying that for a long time. Could you maybe shoot for just one other thing and make it just a little bit easier?" So I said, "Well, geez, we're having a cybersecurity seminar today. Could you please give me the answer for what our cybersecurity policy should be in the world today?" He goes, "Can we revisit that piece of the Middle East question again?" So that kind of goes towards what this issue is and how topical it is. We have a very distinguished panel with us here today. The biographies are in your books, so I won't bore you with that. Howard Schmidt was invited today. You can see that Mr. Howard Schmidt is not here. He declined late Monday evening, and the White House was unable to provide a replacement. But Ambassador Dave Smith and Mr. Dan Gallington, I think, will offer some very prescient thoughts on this topic as well. We're going to start off with Jamie Barnett, followed by General Shea, followed by Ambassador Dave Smith, and Dan Gallington's going to back cleanup for us today, so to speak. Now, the way we like to run this is I've asked each of these gentlemen to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes. And at that point in time, I ask you to hold your questions. The last hour or so, we will hold a Q&A where hopefully their comments and their thoughts will inspire you to get into a nice question round and debate, so to speak. And then right at 4 o'clock, I'll cut it off because we're going to have some wine, cheese, and some beer over there, and you'll hear the folks setting it up right at the tail end. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way, and Jamie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Dave, thanks so much. I appreciate it, and I realize now I must have been behind you. I ran over some damn big frog. And so it's great to be here at Potomac Institute, and the reason is that this is where I belong. As some of you know, I am a senior research fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and am on loan, I guess you say, to the Federal Communications Commission as the chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau there. And I might add this as a disclaimer, I'm here on my own time. Because of that relationship, I actually have to take leave to come back over here. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk to you a little bit today. So just 2 seconds on context. Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau was created at the FCC in 2006 following Katrina. Several pieces were pulled together. So we licensed police, fire, and emergency medical radio wireless systems. We also handle 911 policy for the nation. We've been very involved in the ongoing debate about a public safety broadband network for police and fire and other emergency first responders. We also have, as part of our portfolio, communications reliability. And this is not just for public safety, this is actually the safety of the public. And so how reliable our communication networks are. And as we move into the broadband world, we're, of course, increasingly interested in that. In that particular part of the portfolio is where we get the cybersecurity, and that's so we handle that for the Commission and for Chairman Janikowski. So I'd like to mention just a few things that we're thinking about right now and talk about, and you'll see that these come from a regulatory standpoint. And just so I don't forget which ones I'm talking about, I'll go ahead and declare them up front. One is the cybersecurity aspects of the supply chain for our communication systems to include the internet. Another issue that we're very interested in is of course, remediating malware and botnets, what can be done about that, and a little bit about route hijacking and the security of our border gateway protocols. So first with supply chain, of course, on all of this, the question really is, what is the proper role of government when it's clearly understood that the large part of the infrastructure that we're talking about is not owned by the government. And we don't want in any way to have regulations that stymie the internet, that create any conditions or environment where you can't have the growth that we've already seen and that the internet promises. But where the markets are not going to deliver that type of security, there probably is a role for government, and there is a great effort right now across the government in doing so. And when I say across the government, part of that I'm involved in, part of it I'm a witness to, because the FCC is, of course, not part, technically, of the administration as an independent regulatory agency. With regard to the supply chain, at this point, for our telecommunications industry, it would be hard to point to much of the manufacturing that occurs in the United States solely anymore. As a matter of fact, for any type of equipment that you might have, either what I would refer to as legacy technology or new technologies, if you pull the top off of it, probably there's a good bit of it that's not made in the United States. And a good bit of it may be made in China or other places like that. And so the concern comes in is, what is the security of your supply chain? What is the security of your networks if things are able to fit in there? Heretofore, we have approached, and when I say the government has approached this as more of a foreign versus domestic proposition. Now, since it's all pretty much foreign, the question is, how do we make sure that it is secure? And one of the ways that we are starting to think about this is really not so much from the foreign versus domestic and a trade standpoint, although certainly there are parts of the government that are thinking about that, and it's totally appropriate, but really approaching it from a network security aspect. And in doing so, perhaps the best thing that we could do is recognizing that there is always going to be risk, and that risk cannot be reduced to zero. One of the best things that we can do to manage that risk with regard to the supply chain. And so part of that that we may recommend and may push forward, it's still in a search mode. We haven't made any decisions on this. But perhaps what we need to do is inventory the elements of the communications network, including our new technologies, and rank those of what are the most critical elements. And of course, I can tell you, as an example of the legacy technologies, certainly your signaling and control elements are going to be the most critical. So like one element is called a signaling, and I apologize for getting very wonkish on that. I won't go very long on that, but a signaling transfer point, STP. It's a very important piece of equipment within the legacy communications network. It has to be constantly updated, which means it has a line back to the company that provides it. Well, that line can go back to someplace in the United States, or it can go to some other country. So maybe that is one of those elements that we would say, this is critical. And in order to do that, we were going to lay the highest level of security on that, maybe even as high as we might in the Department of Defense for defense procurement type things. And maybe we need to impose standards of that, like the common criteria that's been developed. And from that level, you can actually rank that down, so there will be many tiers. As the risk diminishes, then perhaps the imposition on industry for providing that level of security would go down. Once again, this is a recognition that we cannot have 100% security because we can't afford it, but there are ways to manage it. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about on supply chain management with regard to those types of risks to the security of our networks, which would include cybersecurity. The administration is conducting a great effort right now across multiple agencies to do this, looking at both short-term, what do we do right away type of solutions, as well as more long-term solutions, and a fairly significant effort at risk assessment. So the risk assessment aspect actually suggests that at some point there's going to be some risk management plan, and that makes sense to me. Another area that we are looking at very strongly are the problem of malware and botnets. And so I know that this is a sophisticated audience, but let me talk a little bit about this. Of course, these are the situations where, of course, you're surfing the internet. It could be any number of things. You're opening an email that maybe you shouldn't have. You visit a website that you shouldn't. Your computer gets infected, or your mom's computer, your daughter's computer, and now we have to start thinking about the things that you're carrying in your pockets with smartphones and everything like that. That's the next big growth area in malware. That malware can perhaps follow your keystrokes, take your passwords, and in one sense, one of the main things that we're concerned about, I know that the luminaries that are sitting at the table with me. By the way, I noticed that Dave, that you didn't go in order either of seniority or of intelligence, but I'm glad to go first, so I get to listen to them. But they can talk extensively about the problem that we have with botnets. We've seen these problems, these attacks. They have occurred even as recent. I know at least one significant one in Australia last week. And the ones that we were perhaps more concerned about are the ones that we're not seeing, the ones that are sleeping and can be called into action for some nefarious purpose. Part of the things that I think that we have to look at, because once again, we're still talking about privately owned infrastructure, and we're talking about a lot of users, some of which are sophisticated enterprise users, some of which, like I said, are my mom, and who's going to visit whatever website she wants to visit, and I probably can't do very much about that. All of the various solutions that I've seen have all looked at various methods of ensuring that there's detection, notification of the user, some type of remediation, and then there are also education and prevention programs. And one of the things that you will see the FCC doing is, and actions that we've already taken, let me mention, the FCC has to act based on the information that we take into our record. And one of the ways that we get that record is we form advisory committees under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, FACA Act. We had one that was commissioned just as I got to the FCC back in 2009, called CSRIC, so the Communication Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, or CSRIC. In December of 2010, they delivered their report, which came out with 24 best practices for botnet remediation and prevention. That lays the groundwork for the current CSRIC, which we just impaneled last month. And we've got some real luminaries that are serving on this current CSRIC. People that you probably have heard of, Mike O'Riordan of Comcast, and the Messaging Anti-Abuse Working Group of MOG. We have people like Steve Crocker of ICON, Ari Schwartz came and spoke to us, Alan Powler of the SANS Institute, who I actually met here at one of our computer science things. They're all developing, and what they're working on, in essence, is a voluntary code of conduct for ISPs in botnet remediation. And so I'm sure they're going to borrow heavily from the Australian, from the German, and the Japanese. The Japanese code of conduct has been around, or their method at least been around, I think, since 2006. But in addition to that, they'll be taking in a lot of information from experts all over the United States to try and come up with that, because we do see that as one of the main things. But I think what you'll see from that is questions of or suggestions of best practices on the detection, prevention, notification, and remediation. And in saying so, there's one additional thing that I think the FCC may be able to help out, and it's sometimes missing in other things that the government can do where there is a voluntary schema, and that is measurement. We need to be able to have performance metrics to see if we're actually instituting these best practices and the voluntary code. And so that's one of the things that we'll also want this CISRIC to do, is develop those types of things. And then the final thing, well, I'm not going to say final thing, but the next major thing is, and I've got one little stinger at the end, that we're looking at is the problem of route hijacking. So the FCC does have an ongoing relationship, regulatory relationship, with, in essence, most of the companies that operate the core of the network. The network was developed by such luminaries as Charles here and other folks at ARPA and DARPA. And in essence, at the first, it was a handshake agreement among people who basically knew each other and trusted each other. And it actually has not gotten much more secure since then. In this case, and just to a little bit more about route hijacking, we have autonomous networks out there, autonomous systems. Network A is on, it wants to send traffic to network B. Network X can actually come online and say, hey, I'm network B, send your traffic to me. And that's what happens. And network X can actually continue that traffic onto network B or not. And so that's a very simplistic description of route hijacking. Most of the time it's self-correcting. The networks and autonomous systems recognize what happened and they change it very quickly. But it is the reason why you saw YouTube traffic going through Pakistan and why a lot of traffic from the United States went through China. And it happens from time to time. Sometimes it can be malicious. A lot of times it's actually fat fingering or some type of mistake. What we'd like to see is a movement from the border gateway protocols that we currently have that are so based on trust and move to a secure border gateway protocol. And these standards are actually being worked on right now. So secure BGP. Well, why don't we just do that now? Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, it costs money. And in some cases, it may be a lot of money for some systems. The second thing is volunteers and pioneers are punished. If I'm a particular carrier, I say, well, I'm going to do something about route hijacking. I'm going to adopt secure border gateway protocols. I adopt it. I spend a bunch of money. If nobody else does it, there's two things happen. Number one, I've just increased the cost of my infrastructure. And number two, it's no more secure because nobody else has it at that point either. So this may be one area where there may be some encouragement from government to have a collective action. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that that would be regulatory in aspect. It may be something that we can actually form it. The FCC has had this kind of situation before. We said, let's get everybody together. Let's see if we can do this. And if we are going to do it in a voluntary method, I would say now would be good because most of the tier 1 internet service providers still have a pretty heavy center of gravity in the United States. That may not always be the case. And so this would be a good time to do it. But one of the things that we definitely want to look at is how can we move forward to a secure border gateway protocol. And then one other thing, kind of on a global thing, am I still doing on time? The FCC has always been very interested in network reliability. And we actually have an open proceeding right now that would do a couple of things. Number one, we know a whole lot about the reliability of our legacy communications. It really is, regardless of whatever problems you may have had with your particular carrier, one of the most reliable systems that you have in the world. And anytime you go overseas, you sometimes run into the fact that not every system is. One of the reasons for that is that the FCC requires outages to be reported to us. We take that data and actually analyze it, work through that. So I don't know if there anybody here lives in Montgomery County. No Montgomery County people. Okay, so Charles lives in Montgomery County. So back in January this year, there was a major 911 outage when we had all that snow. That information was reported to us. We were able to work with the carriers. One carrier was the one that was in the press, but what we found out is it was an alignment of some systems that could be replicated in other carriers as well. And we were able to correct that, and you won't see that happening anymore. Well, when you shift over to broadband and internet systems, that reporting scheme does not exist. If you have an outage of your interconnected VoIP, or you use some other broadband services for your communications, and you have an outage, We don't get that. We don't get the data. We don't get to analyze it. We don't get to work with those providers to try to do that. And so this particular proceeding is to look at, shouldn't we expect the same level, the same standards of reliability on our broadband communications as we expect from our legacy of wireline and wireless communications. So I would invite this august audience and panelists to actually file. We'd like to know what you think about this. We're data-driven. We can't make decisions unless it's actually in our record, and that record is very easy to get into. All you do is have to write us a letter. My team in my bureau, actually, we have about half lawyers and engineers, which is an interesting dynamic, but they pick through the things that you send in order for us to make decisions. And with that, Dave, thanks so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you. Appreciate it.
Well, since there are at least 5 Marines in this room, I'm going to have to tell a Marine joke. Throughout my entire career, I think everyone here can attest to that. We've had to listen to Marine jokes. One I'm going to tell one a little bit different slant. Seems that when Patton died, he was deciding what he was going to do for the rest of eternity, and he went up to the pearly gates, and he was met there by St. Peter. And St. Peter said, well, welcome to heaven. And Patton said, well, I'm not sure I want to come into heaven. And St. Peter said, why? He said, because I heard there's Marines in here. He said, you know, they're always exaggerating things. They're always getting a lot more credit for what's going on than they deserve. And we in the Army and the other services get the brunt of the joke. And St. Peter said, listen, Patton, you don't have to be concerned at all about Marines being in heaven. They're too gross, they're vulgar and everything. They live filthy lives. So you won't find any heavens in here. Patton says, are you sure? And St. Peter said, I'm sure. Come on in and take a look around and see what you see. So Patton walks in, he takes a right-hand turn, he walks down this beautiful gilded street, golden buildings. It's just absolutely spectacular. And down at the end of the avenue, he sees this big, bright illumination coming out. And all of a sudden, out from that illumination comes a Marine wearing chevrons, medals across his chest. Patton looks at him, stomps back to St. Peter, and he says to St. Peter, you told me there were no Marines in heaven. St. Peter thought for a minute, and he looked at Patton, he smiled, and he said, that's not a Marine, that's God. He just thinks he's a Marine. I hope they didn't count in my time. Well, it's interesting to kind of be on the sideline now and to watch the cyber debate and see how different perspectives are evolving and the discussion and how that's shaping up. I think we're all shaped by our experiences and the things that we've learned in the past, and I'm certainly no exception to that. And my perspectives were strongly shaped back in my days as the Director of Command and Control Communications of the Pacific Command, back in the 1995, 1998 time frame, when the first Terminal Fury exercise went down. And there was a lot of things that came out of Terminal Fury that really shaped the way I viewed the world. That plus things that had happened during the Cold War. And so that really was a defining period of time for me. Additionally, one of the advantages or one of the pleasures I've had is to be on some of the national study boards like the Defense Science Board and National Research Council. And I realize what a great amount of talent there is out there in academia. And I just, I mean, people understand the operational issues as well as the technical issues. And I just kick myself that back in that day, back when I was wearing my uniform, that I wasn't smart enough to reach out and gather the perspectives of people such as yourselves and others in academia. And I think overall the nation as a whole has failed to tap that, and I would encourage you to go out there and talk to your counterparts and try to get more engaged with the government. Most of my focus, as you all probably know, has been with the Department of Defense, but I realize that's only a piece of what goes on in terms of the cyber strategy and the issues that deal with cyber from a national perspective. And certainly the challenge of coordinating cyber efforts across the government industry is immense, and I can't think of any challenges any more significant than this. I had a discussion with one of my counterparts a few years back who later became a combatant commander, and he said, surely this cyber issue that you keep asking for money for can't be any more complex than building a nuclear aircraft carrier. Well, I've talked to that gentleman since he was a combatant commander who had to deal with cyber issues, and he assures me that cyber is much more complex than dealing with a nuclear carrier. And the challenge is there are really few who really understand the complexity and scope of cyber, and even fewer have to operate at a high level in the cyber environment. Thus, there really is few models and not a lot of experience to draw upon when we're trying to shape this national debate. There is one high-level strategic model that I found interesting. It's one that I was asked to comment about a year and a half ago with one of the agencies. And if you can imagine a triangle, okay, the bottom, in terms of all of, not all, but many of the things that are involved in developing cyber policy and going after the issues. If you think of the base of that triangle, 30% of what goes on in the cyber is kind of noise, what we call down on noise. It's maybe a student or a young person going in there, hitting the internet, maybe trying to get into some site that he probably shouldn't be allowed to. But he's not malicious, and he's not, he has no ill intent. And then if you go from that 30% up to 80%, those are the things that the human can fix. Those are things that we can fix. But number one, culture is in the way, training is in the way, education is in the way, biases are in the way, the lack of good acquisition strategy. There's a whole bunch of things, the cultural things, the human characteristics of what goes on that get in the way. And then the top 20% of that model, and those we can fix if we have a mind to do it. And the argument was that if you look at the top 20%, 10% of that threat that we're dealing with we can manage, and it'll allow us to spend and focus our really sophisticated resources to go after that top 10%. The problem is that those people that are dealing with the top 20% of the issue from a cyber perspective get dragged down into that 80% that we should be able to fix. And whether it's a culture issue, whether it's configuration management issue, configuration control, training, education, policy, all those types of things that can be humanly fixed are distracting the pros from Dover, for lack of a better term, from going out and doing those types of things that are important for us to do. We as a nation sure have a lot at risk if we ever become involved in a major cyber conflict. And two of the axioms that I've used over time was that the nation that had the most to gain from technology had the most to lose if we were denied access to that technology. So you think about that. And then from a DoD perspective, from a warfighting perspective, for every leap we take in technology, there's a relatively inexpensive counter to that technology. If we want to talk about that later on, I'm more than happy to do that, whether it's in the follow-on or in the reception. Does that mean we shun technology? Absolutely it doesn't. It just needs to, we need to be aware of it. And when we approach cyber, we need to take it from a holistic approach. We need to take it from our tendency right now is to have a very narrow focus. We often think of it as the desktop, maybe the local area network we're on, but there's a lot more involved in this world of cyber than just that. It's the information, it's the software, it's the microchips, computing, transport, routing, switching, timing, operating systems, the satellite network that we want, network design, supply chain management, training, space, configuration management, configuration control. Those are all things that contribute to the challenge that we've got to deal with, and we just haven't developed the culture at this point in time to really deal with this in an effective manner to help us deal with the threat. And today's culture demands a process is open and collaborative, and yet that presently puts us in conflict with our ability to selectively protect and restrict sensitive information in many cases. So as the nation moves forward in the cyber-dependent world at this point in time, at the top of the list of things to do, in my view, is the establishment of an effective command and control structure, or coordination control structure, because let's face it, not everybody's going to fall under command. You look at the elements of national power, defense, economic, and diplomatic, and we need a C2 structure that is responsive to the needs of all those elements. One that addresses national responsibilities and emergencies and a response to those across all elements of power. Many of the challenges we faced are based upon our culture and the distrust elements have between themselves and the government, and quite frankly within the government. I think we all know that. Today's efforts, in my view, are disjointed. The DoD is the big dog in the tent, only because they've got the resources and can focus leadership to attack these related issues. And even they can't agree on a command and control structure for the department. COCOMs have one perspective, the services have another perspective, and Cyber Command has a little bit different perspective. I mean, there's a Venn diagram where they all meet in some regard, but not for the most part, but for a significant part of that, they're outside that interlocking piece of what's going on. And to complicate matters, there's a long-standing tension and distrust of the DoD within the rest of the government. I mean, you see that when you read studies like the Beyond Goldwater-Nichols study. It's often argued that DoD is too powerful and influential as it deals in some of these issues within the department, and you know, kind of left to its own devices. DoD does as DoD sees fit in many cases. Further, without a legal framework requiring adherence to the strategy that's developed, the accountability and the synchronization of resources, any strategy is going to be filled with gaps and seams. And quite frankly, when you look at cyber across the government as well as you look at the commercial world, there are a lot of gaps and seams that still need to be filled. So the question becomes, is there a national organizational model that we build upon for strategic governance of cyber infrastructure? Obviously, today, we haven't come up with one, but over the years, I've been introduced to something that is interesting, and an interesting framework, and I'd just like to read a couple pieces. This is an interagency group, and it came as a result of Executive Order 12344 of February 1982. And it says that recognition of the crucial importance of national security of the naval nuclear power propulsion program. So that was the founding and the establishment of that. And let me just read you a couple points. An integrated program carried out by two organizational units, one in the Department of Energy and one in the Department of the Navy, headed by the same individual, so the activities of each may continue in practice under common management. This individual shall direct the naval nuclear propulsion program in both departments. The director shall be qualified by reason of technical background and experience. He will obtain approval from the president for the appointment of the director. The term will be 8 years, and that's a key point. Is responsible for research, development, design, acquisition, specification, construction, inspection, installation, certification, testing, overhaul, refueling, operating practices and procedures, maintenance, supply support, and the ultimate disposition. It's also responsible for safety, training, and a whole series of other things that have gone on spelled out. So here, there may be some value to looking at that model, analyzing that model, see if there isn't a structure, at least within the government, that helps us move forward and and get us away from this kind of disjointed consortium that we've got at this point in time. And it doesn't address all the elements of national strength. That it may be a way for us to move forward. In my view, at this point in time, there's a disproportionate intelligence community influence in shaping the debate. The intel community is a key stakeholder, and they've got a powerful influence in the fight, but they shouldn't be the drivers of the debate. They should be major contributors, but in a direct support and supporting role. Unfortunately, this time, we're lacking highly knowledgeable and experienced set of cyber experts, both in terms of policy and the arts and the science and the practice of cyber across government as well as across industry. And the signals intelligence community and the communications communities in particular provide a nucleus for understanding. But from my perspective, we need a broader set of functional expertise. Put it in military terms, we need more operator involvement in what's going on and making a decision. There's a need to examine how resources are allocated within the federal government between the defense, the attack, and the exploit part of what's going on, and determine if the ratio is correct. There is a need to develop and improve intelligence and early warning capability to alert the nation to cyber events before they happen. I mean, right now the intel community is good about telling us what has happened, but I think there's a long way to go to providing effective indications and warning and understanding what the intent is of those things that are coming into our network. Are they malicious? Is somebody just coming in? What is, some sense of what the end state is? And it's challenging work. It's hard. So make no mistake about it. This is not a criticism. It's just a matter of something I think that we need to move on with. I think we're continually shooting behind the target. We all know too often what has happened. We need to find out before it's happened what's going on. Another area that I've got a lot of concern or interest is, and it goes back to the comment that was just made, do we have the proper metrics? I can look at the numbers all day, but a lot of those numbers don't seem to make a lot of sense to me. I remember being in the J6, and I get briefed every week on the number of attacks going on in the network. And finally I said, how do you know these are attacks? How do you know what's going on? How do you know it's not some kid that's just coming in there? But if you look at the numbers, they'll tell you we've had 40,000 hits a day or whatever the magic number may be at any given time. I don't consider those attacks. We need to find a way to distinguish between what is really malicious intent and what is just someone going on and being curious more than anything else. And maybe the fact of the matter, even able to get in something ought to cause us concern. You know, part and parcel of developing that effective command and control system I talked about is the development of a detailed education and information campaign. One can argue that the issues relating to cyber can't be effectively dealt with until the key decision makers are and their support structures are educated to the issues and the second and third order effects about what the decisions are that they're making. Unfortunately, there are few people who really fully understand this whole cyber environment and the issues relating to operating an environment that's under threat. So I think it's forums like this that really are very important to the nation and to open up the national discourse. But time is running short and we need to get moving on with business. As a matter of fact, one could argue we need to be, we're well behind the curve again. So in my view, I think one of the things the government needs to do is open its kimono to a much broader audience as part of the educational campaign to make industry and some of the key people in academia in particular aware of just the extent of the threat and let them, in some cases, let them challenge what's going on. And we tend up in many cases talking to ourselves. And under the guise of training and education where we're at, I think we need to raise the bar on standards and certifications for users and operators. I mean, I kind of look at the national transportation system we've got in the United States, and you look at the highway model. There's a lot of good analogies to be drawn there. We don't let just anybody get on the network. When you're out there on the internet, that's fine, but when you come and you're working inside the government, I think we need to take a little bit different approach. In terms of research and development, the government research and development in the area of cyber defense is woefully under budgeted, and there's too much redundancy of the R&D efforts. There needs to be a renewed emphasis on R&D. A coordinated effort needed to eliminate that redundancy and focus research on the gaps of capability. There needs to be a reward system of increased incentives and funding for those labs and organizations and the consortia out there that develop and field successful and effective solutions. And one of my pet peeves is the acquisition community in government needs to get away from awarding contracts on the basis of technically acceptable lowest cost. We need to be jumping over the bar, not tripping over it. When it comes to cyber, you get what you pay for. And you know, we wouldn't take this approach with a nuclear weapons program or with an aviation program. So understanding the balance between cost, efficiency, and mission effectiveness is important. From a national security perspective, effectiveness doesn't equal efficiency, or the other way around, or efficiency doesn't equal effectiveness. And I'll close it out. We'll talk a little bit about risk management. Risk analysis is needed at the mission level across all the government and industry. Information assurance posture of the government should be based on the need to maintain mission assurance. Think in terms of mission, okay, when we're dealing with the government. And at levels of risk commensurate with those accepted from other threat sources. Risk is measured by the consequences of things that go wrong and the corresponding likelihood of occurrence. When consequences are extreme, the likelihood of occurrence needs to be driven towards zero. So there's a need for rigorous mission analysis of information assurance issues. And the same level of rigor in risk analysis is needed we place on other such key programs as aircraft carriers and our space program. And there's a lot to be learned from industry there. Verizon and several other companies have gone out there and done some great work. And then finally, from a little bit of a technical perspective, there's a lot of neat things that are done in industry that just don't fit in the DoD model from a security perspective. And I don't want to get into too much detail there, but you got to be careful how you consolidate your network, because there is a level of risk that comes into the network when you do that. And then finally, I'll just kind of close it out. I think there's great opportunity out there for public-private venture opportunities. I think the government's got to open up its kimono a little bit more a lot more actually, to industry, to let them understand what the threat is, both so that there can be a greater cooperation, there's a better understanding, and that a better sense of the need for education and training can evolve from that. Okay? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. I guess first of all I have to apologize for not being Howard Schmidt. But please don't hold it against me. I mean, I've actually never been Howard Schmidt. So, and secondly, let me apologize for these notes were scribbled yesterday. A little bit of jet lag. I just traveled back from Georgia or to the country, not the state, when General Reist informed me that I would be Howard Schmidt.
And you're doing a hell of a job.
And I do a hell of a job. So I'm not going to tell you what's going on in the White House. I'm going to try and answer some of the questions that General Reist has posed in the title of this, where are we and where should we be? And I'm going to try and confine my remarks mostly, at least on the where should we be, to the international arena. I very much appreciate General Shea's comments, particularly about culture, because culture is one of those things that really does, it gets in the way, but you have to recognize you've got one. And sometimes we Americans sort of forget that we have culture too. We sort of think we're normal. But the reality is, when other people look at us, we have a culture too, and it has some very good things about it, but it also has some drawbacks, and those are things you have to work with. And then I really identified with the other thing that General Shea mentioned about how you procure things. I remember when I worked in the United States Senate, sitting in a conversation with who was then Senator John Glenn, who of course was our first man in space, and somebody said, well, you know, how did it feel? I mean, what was your recollection? And he said, well, you know, you're up at the top of this thing with 3 stages, and you know, when you get that ignition, you can hear it, you know, 2, 1, ignition, you know, and you can really feel this thing shaking. And he said, you know, I couldn't help but think, though, I'm sitting on top of 3 very powerful rockets, all bought on the basis of the lowest bid. So I mean, I think we got to keep that in mind. So where are we? Well, I think we're in a transition. You know, people get very frustrated about we're not doing everything we should be doing. Of course we're not doing everything we should be doing. We're kind of in a transition period. This is new. And all the wringing of hands and whatnot, if you go back to new technologies, we did, I think, our first program, I did a presentation on the beginning of the nuclear era. And if you think everybody had it together, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to build, this is what we're going to build, this is going to be our doctrine, that's not how it happened. There was a lot of wringing of hands, a lot of mistakes made, you know, I think we're kind of going through that. Problem is, we have a rapidly developing threat. You can say, don't wring your hands, this is normal, but the reality is, you know, here's this monster creeping up behind you, and so you have to be cognizant of that as well. Let me talk about sort of 4 axes that I see, and I think we have to kind of put them together. And I think one of the issues that bothers me in this cyber debate is that we seem to put them apart. We talk about one thing, and we talk about another, and we compartmentalize. The first one is technology. There's a lot of stuff going on out there. Everything from script kiddies, such as the Russians used to attack Georgia and Estonia, people with average computer skills who are simply given a script. This is what you do. Do this, do this, do this, and you can actually make a heck of a mess. This is not high-tech stuff, but it can be very dangerous. All the way to Stuxnet on the far end, which people talk about a cyber weapon of mass destruction. Potentially it could be. And where should you concentrate your efforts? Well, one side might say, well, you better do that high-tech stuff because that stuff's really dangerous. On the other hand, I can tell you from personal experience, a country was attacked, literally kinetically and through cyberspace, with script kiddies. So you can't ignore the low end of the technology. You've got to look at all of it. Then there's actors. Nation states remain the major actor. Not the only actor, but they remain the major actor. That is a reality. What's attacking the United States, it's China, it's Russia, it may be other countries. What attacked Georgia and Estonia was Russia. These are still major, major players, but they're not alone. Terrorists are not far behind. We know terrorists are using the internet to communicate, to find information, to do all sorts of things. To date, we haven't seen a major terrorist attack through the internet. That doesn't mean you're not going to. They seem to like things that go boom. And, you know, if you want to have a nice jihad and you want to blow yourself up, it's hard to do through a fiber optic cable. But at some point, they're going to make something go boom. And I think we need to be aware of that. Then there's sort of the cyber social malefactors, I've called them. This is kind of a new phenomenon. It's why I created sort of another title for them. I'm talking about Anonymous, LulzSec, these sort of self-appointed people who have no borders, no loyalties, who have some sort of self-appointed loyalty to some crazy idea that only they really understand. And they've taken it upon themselves to punish the rest of the world for transgressions against whatever it is that they believe in. Now, I'm being a little facetious, but I think this is a real phenomenon out there, particularly in the Western world. These people are out there, they have some skills, and we need to think about it. Then there's hooligans. Well, you know, there's always been hooligans. Markers who paint up the New York City subways and so on and so forth. Those guys have always been out there, but they can do some damage. I had the devil appear on my screen a couple of months ago. Can't really figure out what the heck the damn thing did, other than the devil came and laughed at me. I took it to some people, they cleaned it out, I said, well, what does it actually do? Well, it's a virus. I said, well, I got that. But I mean, what is it? He said, well, as far as I can tell, it just shows you the devil and he laughs at you. Okay. As viruses go, I guess it wasn't a bad thing to get, but okay. There's hacktivists. This is the script kiddies. They're out there, as the Russians are proving, they can be organized. Now, make no mistake, the people who organized the attacks on Estonia and Georgia, and by the way, the people who organized the internal attacks on the blog site LiveJournal and the newspaper Novaya Gazeta, are not script kiddies. They are not hacktivists. They are not amateurs. They are very, very well organized. But they use these people. And so I think we need to think about who's out there and what are they doing. And, well, finally, there's criminals. Well, criminals have been around for a long time in just about every culture. They're out there, and guys with cyber capabilities use cyber. You get everything from, you know, dear Charles, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm in London and I've been robbed. And could you please send me $2,000? I'm really embarrassed, but I'll pay you back as soon as I can. And I can't really talk to you on the phone now because I have to go to the police station. But my new friend, Mr. Ugugunjabunga, will be glad to talk to you and take the money.
I get email like that a lot. more interesting numbers.
You haven't sent
That's
me
a
any
standard,
money yet, though. You know, you know. And then there's purposes, and I think you have to look at that too. Well, there's the hooliganism. Just I want to see what I can do. There's crime. That's easy to understand. I mean, there's a motivation. In a sense, I kind of like that one because you know what they're up to. I want to steal money from your bank account. I mean, I got it. Espionage. I want to exploit a vulnerability to get into your system and steal some information. Even if you don't know who did it, even if you don't know exactly what they're after, it's fairly easy to define. You understand what they're doing. Somebody's trying to reach in and take something out of your safe. It gets harder when you start talking about terrorism and war. What is a cyber war? What is cyber terrorism? Do they occur with kinetic effects also? Can they occur by themselves? When is it war? When is it not war? What's an act of war? Those are hard questions. But I think sometimes we belabor them a little bit too much. One thing I would offer to this community is we badly need scenarios. The scenarios that we see tend to run sort of like, if you've seen that movie, Live Free or Die Hard. It's a great movie, but you really sit there watching it thinking, why are they doing this? Okay, you can blow out every traffic light in Washington, D.C. Okay, cool. But what's the scenario? Why would you do that? I can think of reasons you would do it, but I don't think they're very well written up, and I think we really need some work on that. And then the fourth axis that I want to talk about is internationalization. I think we've got to get away from this notion of cyberspace. There ain't no such place, folks. It's not a commons. It is not outer space. It is not an ocean. Oceans are places. They are places where there is no sovereign authority. Outer space is a place. It's a place where there's no sovereign authority. Cyberspace is not. It's a nice idiom to use, but the reality is everything that can touch you is on the territory of somebody. Now, the stuff moves around. This is not like tanks where here they come, and they cross a border, and we can, you know, here they come, and they're crossing our border. Yep, it's a little more elusive than that. Stuff moves at the speed of light. It's very elusive, although it's not irrational. A lot of people think things move around the system. They're not irrational. We know why they move in various directions. You can't necessarily predict it, and I can't tell you while it's happening in real time, but there's logic to it. And they move across borders, of course, at the speed of light, and so you're zipping around. But the reality is, and I'm going to come back to this, I'm saying this for a reason about some of the things we need to be doing, is everything and everybody doing anything to you, whether they're hooligans, whether they're criminals, whether they're terrorists, a nation state trying to attack you, whatever they are somewhere. Their computers are somewhere on a desk someplace. Their servers are somewhere, and the guys doing it are somewhere. And they are citizens of a country somewhere. So, that's where I think we are. Now, that's a heck of a mess. So where do we go from here? What should we be doing? This is where I said I'm going to confine my remarks to the international plane of what we should be doing on international cooperation, because A, it's the thing I know, B, it's the thing I wrote down in the taxi yesterday, C, I don't have the time to go through all of this, and D, I really don't know a lot of the stuff. There's a lot of stuff we should be doing, and there's other people more qualified in this room than I to address them. Obviously, we need to be doing international cooperation. If you take what I just said, this stuff is zipping around across borders. Yes, the person who's doing this may be living somewhere, but he may not be living where you are. He may be in India, he may be in Vietnam, he may be in Brazil, he may be in Russia, and he may be in Russia and making it look like he's in Vietnam. So obviously we need international cooperation on whatever we're doing. It's the only way to go. But which way? There's an awful lot of proposals out there, which frankly, I got to tell you, from looking at this stuff in this life of mine, but also from the perspective that I bring to it from the arms control world of looking at this stuff for 30 years of trying to negotiate things, I can tell you there's right ways and there's wrong ways to do this stuff. So what do? We need to recognize that we're dealing with a clash of cultures, of interests, of ways of life, of government systems. That is a reality. And this hands across the water approach that I hear altogether too often from Western capitals, including this one, that we all have a problem and so we all need to get together. Folks, it ain't going to work. If the world worked that way, we wouldn't have a room full of Marines and generals in here who spent their career defending the country. You're defending the country against something. And don't imagine that cyber is any different. You're defending the country against something. People who don't see the world the way you do. And you can't go out and reach out to them and expect them to sort of shake your hand and say, oh yes, we all have a problem. It's not going to work that way. You can't expect progress by explaining things. We keep getting this. It's a very Anglo-Saxon. And here's where I think General Shea's remarks about cultures getting in the way. This is our culture. It's American heritage. It's the Anglo-Saxon approach to things. It's a legalistic way of looking at things. It's a rationalistic way of looking at things. If they understood it, then they would see what we're saying. They do understand it. They see it a different way than you do. Okay? And I keep seeing this. Just take an analogy from missile defense, for example. The Russians, since Ronald Reagan made his speech in 1983, the Russians have been telling you it's dangerous and destabilizing, and we are going to bring the whole tent down if you keep doing this. Well, it was a good idea then. It's still a good idea. How many delegations have been dispatched to Moscow to explain it to them? And I heard it just last month. We're going to explain it again because their guy at NATO raised it again. If they don't get it, they're going to try and derail the Chicago summit next May. So we dispatch another delegation to explain to them how the system that we are planning to build will have nothing to do with their strategic nuclear deterrent. Even in Russia, they know the world is round, okay? That's not the issue here. And no amount of explaining it is going. They have determined that it is not in their interest for the Americans to go into that area of high technology. And it's the same thing with cyber things. You can keep explaining it to them, but it's a little bit like the president of the PTA seeking a meeting with the local drug lord to explain to him what he's doing to our children. It ain't going to work. Demanding. We demand that they stop doing this. It is intolerable. It's unacceptable. How many times have you heard those words coming out of this city? If the United States of America says something is unacceptable, folks, if we are a superpower, it needs to be unacceptable. Otherwise, keep your mouth shut. Because every time you say it's intolerable or it's unacceptable and you don't do something about it, your power wanes. Just yesterday, we had a hearing on the Hill, and all people, once again, banging their fists on the table. One gentleman said that it's time for us to confront Beijing and demand that they stop this piracy. Look, folks, putting labels on piracy there, you see, I said it's piracy. I'm going to call them names. It ain't going to work. They're doing it for a reason. And there are no consequences the way we are behaving right now. It's not going to work with rule-making. You can't go to the United Nations and get a bunch of rules passed. You can't compartmentalize things. That it just doesn't work. American power, and I'm speaking here as the superpower here. We're not talking about a smaller country. And by the way, many of those smaller countries are looking to us, wondering when and where the leadership is going to come from, because their security is very much tied to our security. But when you're the big guy, you can't compartmentalize this thing. You can't say, well, this is cyber. And then there's this. Look at this debate we've had since the Pentagon issued its report. Okay, it was a first attempt. It's not perfect. There's things you could perfect. But the basic proposition was pretty simple. Look, there are certain circumstances under which a cyber attack on the United States would be an act of war, and we would consider it as such. And in such a circumstance, we would consider using the various tools that we have to defend ourselves and to retaliate. Among them are things that are not cyber. Look at the debate that then ensued about, can we do that? Can we do that? What would it do? It didn't say we will necessarily. Let's go back to the nuclear debate. We never said we will absolutely. We did back in the 50s. And then we realized you can't do that. Massive retaliation doesn't work. No, I can't tell you, if you do this to me, I will do this. What I am telling you is I have a full arsenal of things. And I can hit back at you. Some of them are kinetic, and you're going to see them go bang and boom, and you're going to burn. Some of them may be cyber, and I'm not going to shy away from it. Yes, absolutely, we need to be there. I am not saying that if we have a cyber attack, we necessarily retaliate with cyber. I'm saying it's a tool. It's an arrow in our quiver. And you need to know, if you attack the United States, something bad is going to happen to you. And you can't pull power apart. The other countries' perception of us is not just, well, they're very powerful in cyber, but you know, they kind of abandon their allies and coddle their enemies. You can't do that. You gotta have a holistic view of the power. So what do? First of all, stop using an ideal standard. General Shea mentioned, yeah, there's a lot of seams and gaps in this thing. There's going to be a lot of seams and gaps. Anybody who's ever done any real operational stuff, whether it's cyber, whether it's nuclear weapons, whether it's special operations, whatever it is, there's a lot of seams and gaps. You can write all the doctrines you want. Believe me, there's a lot of seams and gaps, and that's why you keep going back and studying it and studying it and studying it. We have to recognize our interests. The United States has interests. We have them in cyber, we have them in many other things, and we need to start articulating them and not be shamed about them. Power is holistic, as I said. We need to think about deterrence. Deterrence is capability times will. It's that simple. And if you think cyber, high-tech, anything changes, anything, it doesn't. It's capability times will. People need to believe that you have the ability to inflict an unacceptable cost on them, whatever that cost may be. It may be a cyber cost, it may not be. It may be an economic thing. It may be social. It may be, there are lots of things it could be, but whatever it is, you have to have the ability and the will. He's got to believe that you can actually do that. We need to start seeing adversaries. We need to understand other cultures are not like us. There's an interesting story about FBI going over to talk to their Russian counterparts. The FBI does not have Russian counterparts. The FSB is a criminal organization. It enforces the law when it wants to enforce the law for political purposes. It violates the law when it wants to. They went over with some evidence about botnets. 2007. They sat with their counterparts who listened very attentively and then said, thank you very much, we need to go check this out. They left the room. Were gone for 30 or 40 minutes. Came back and said, we're very sorry, we've checked this out. There's these IP addresses, these servers are not in Russia. We're not finding anything. Sorry. When the guys got back to the embassy, they checked it out themselves, and guess what? It's all gone. That's the FSB. You're talking to the brother of the guy who done it. We've got to start understanding that that culture works that way. In that particular country, which I know fairly well, there is a nexus of government, of business, and crime that works differently. You can't imagine the director of the FBI going to dinner with known criminals. That happens in Moscow. And Moscow's not the only culture we're dealing with. There's China, there's all sorts of other things out there. And we've got to understand that we have adversaries. Don't imagine you're going to write a code of conduct. Don't imagine you're going to have a Hague Convention about this. What do we need to do? We need to do cooperation on real cross-border law enforcement, like the European Convention on Cybercrime, or otherwise known as the Budapest Convention, because Americans get all worried because it sounds European. I'm finding out now as I look at this that Indians have got a much bigger problem with it being European. Okay, it's the Budapest Convention. It requires, upon presentation of credible evidence, cross-border law enforcement cooperation. Instead, what is the United States doing? It said it wanted to try and get Russia to sign the European Convention. It couldn't get Russia to do that, so we did the deal to give them the info anyway. So we're going to tell them what we know and what we don't know, with no obligation from them to tell us anything or do anything. Great. We need to work with like-minded countries, not every country, like-minded countries on resilient defenses. What can we do? We're not going to stop everything. And we need to do creative law enforcement. We took down the Rostock botnet a few months ago. What? With creative use of law, with U.S. court orders, they went and actually just seized servers that were sitting in the United States. And that's what I mean about stuff sitting here. Russian criminals. But some of the servers were sitting inside the territory of the United States. The U.S. Marshals banged on the door and said, we're taking this. Now, here's where it ended. And this is why you need to push this European Convention. We can't get the guys in Russia that were doing it. But that's the kind of stuff that needs to be done. You do what you can, cooperating with like-minded countries, such as the NATO Center of Excellence in Tallinn, trying to get these kinds of treaties to force law enforcement cooperation. And for what you can't clean up, and there's going to be a lot that you can't preclude, you need to build resilient defenses, not alone. But don't imagine that you can do it with anything but allied countries. Thank you very much.
We need to scoot out of the way.
Yeah, or you're going to throw the slides on?
The remote is in Dan's hand.
Sure, 25 I will.
You can just
Slide to the side, gentlemen.
What is the slide to the slide?
I'm going to turn that off because you started reading. I'm not Howard Schmidt either. I'm Dan Gallington, and although I'm extremely well prepared for today, because when the notice of this event came out, I was really miffed that I wasn't invited to sit on the distinguished panel on it. This is true. I sent an email to Mike Swetnam, and I told him about it, and I said, is it all right if I come and heckle from the audience? And he said, yeah, sure. We expect you to do that. So come and heckle. So I prepared a lot of heckling things. And when Dave called me last night and said, oh, geez, can you come and sit on the panel because Mr. Reese cannot, I said, sure. And I transformed my heckling notes into presentation notes. Was that hard, by the way?
No, it wasn't. It was really easy to do.
Was that the first heckling remark from the audience? Did you heckle him?
No, I'm behaving.
So now I'm going to show you a slide, but not before I tell you a story, because I noticed that no speaker prior to me mentioned the word privacy at all. Now, it could be because, you know, with today's cyber and that sort of thing, privacy is really sort of irrelevant, even though we talk about it a lot. There are more intrusions into our privacy every day, so the concept really isn't the same as it used to be. And in this regard, I remember a conversation I had with my mom when my mom was 90, smartest person I ever met, as most mothers are. And she was talking, we were watching a news thing about FISA wiretaps, and she was familiar with my career. I spent a lot of time over at DOJ writing collection policy for the FBI and for NSA and other
folks to do that kind of thing. And my mom said to me, listen, she said, I know you've spent a lot of your time doing this sort of stuff, but I really don't think the government ought to be able to listen to anybody's phone conversations. I just don't think it's appropriate. And I said, Mom, okay, but what about, spies, criminals, and terrorists, and that sort of thing? She looked at me like I was about 5. You know how your mom looks at you when you're about 5. And she said, well, those kind of people, sure. So that's the way most people kind of think about privacy when we're talking about things like cybersecurity. And that serves as a good sort of introduction to my comments. I thought I would start by saying, look, let's write down the things that make us so incredibly vulnerable. And our society's open. We have this huge private cyber infrastructure. Much of it, if not most of it, critical to the functioning of our country and most of our government. Over this infrastructure, we only have indirect control in that we can require certain things through our regulatory agencies, through our statutes, through our funding. We can throw money at various people and tell them, you shall do this and you shall do that. You shall improve this and you shall improve that. But we're never assured of any kind of uniform implementation of that. So when you go out and check whether or not people have actually implemented, sometimes with the money you've given them to do stuff to make us more secure cyber-wise, you learn that or they haven't, or they haven't done it very well, or they haven't done it in a way that implements the intent of what you expected them to do. We learned this in CALIA, communications in law enforcement. When Ma Bell broke up in the 90s, we discovered that the DOJ discovered we couldn't implement FISA or Title 18 wiretaps because these new companies didn't know what to do with documents when they were served. They didn't have the capability. They didn't know. So we had to pass a law saying you shall do this, and by the way, here's the money to do it. We're about to do that again with broadband, by the way, shoveling lots of money so that these companies will be able to comply with pre-existing federal and state law. The next thing is the result. We have huge cyber leverages in this country, really more so than in the rest of the world. Certainly if you go on, I wrote an article and cleared it through the PRB, for example. The first paragraph says that when you're in Europe and you make a phone call, use the internet, send a fax, use your cell phone, you also send a copy of that to the local intelligence agency and police department, and they cleared that statement. So I assume that we don't have that view of our cyber infrastructure and telecommunications infrastructure in this country. Never have had. Never have had. But listen, the world is racing around us, you know. We have a system that's basically right out of the 1920s when we compare it with the rest of the world. And much of our critical infrastructure is pre-cyber risk concern. I made that up. I don't know what I wanted it to mean was a lot of the critical infrastructure we have, we built. Jim Woolsey, for example, makes a presentation about the vulnerability of our electrical grid. Incredible. It's all hooked to the internet. Hello. Oh, here's that. these might scare you. I have a rather different view than most of the other speakers about how serious this is. I believe we're vulnerable to crippling cyber attacks, and I agree with the other speakers, only from a few countries. But we're saved primarily because we're such a fat cyber espionage target, they don't want to shut us down. They could if they wanted to. And we're a fat espionage target, and we will continue to be so until we actually get into some kind of hostilities, and then we'll see the nature and extent of the risk. We're the next level of thing, we're vulnerable to serious cyber attack from a few more entities and powers, which does nothing but serve as a huge incentive for them to develop this capability however they can, and they're doing it. Because of its disproportionate ability to wreak havoc with us, would seem to many to be a preferred thing for terrorists to do. Like the idea of disproportionality goes directly with the concept, their strategic concept of attacking us. Disproportionate. Let's take an airplane, fill it full of gas, and hit the trade tower and the Pentagon. We'll spend a real little money, and we'll just raise hell with them, and they did. So this idea of disproportionality, particularly when they learn the great leverages, the banking system, the gas distribution system, the waterway management system, the communications system, I hate to name them all, but most of these things. And the last one scares me, quite frankly, the most. You know, when you want to talk about cyber and skills and that sort of thing, you shouldn't talk to somebody our age. You talk to somebody 12, 14, 16 years old, 18 years old, a kid in college who's really interested in this stuff. The risk of technical surprise, breakthrough, is so disproportionate it serves as a force multiplier beyond anything we can imagine. It's the kind of unknown that Don Rumsfeld used to talk about that scared him the most. The force multiplier. The thing, the guy discovers, oh my, I can do this. Wow. And you know, that's out there and growing every day. Okay? These are my, this was part, Charlie, this was part of my heckling part, but my cyber diatribes I've listed, I tried to in some kind of order. I'm going to list a bunch of things that I find just incredibly wrong with the way we've started to do this. The lines we've drawn between defense, offense, counter, and our refusal to aggressively test our systems by our ability to do it. We have a cyber command. Why aren't we using our cyber command to test the vulnerabilities of the systems that our .gov and our .mil depend on to operate? Well, I have a reason for that. Same reason we don't test when we had ComSec as a primary mission of the NSA, same reason as we don't go against the rest of the government, because it's too damn embarrassing, quite frankly. The security was so bad that the NSA was asked to stop doing this. I'm going back now 40, 50 years. We're talking serious stuff here. So ComSec was only a concept that was used within DoD. You can't have your ComSec guys going out in the government and seeing whether people are talking secrets on the telephone, because they are. So we have that same concept now that's developing with cyber. We're drawing lines between missions. I'm going to talk a bit about content here, even though it's always woven into the cyber dialogue. We have this perennial information operations, public affairs debate going on about content. Content and cyber is something we excel in. How do you think the Arab Spring, what do you think fueled that? Stuff that comes out of our country, you know, free stuff. The social media, that sort of thing. We don't even know how to manage that, and we're afraid to do it because we're obsessed with the public affairs concept of the truth. A little sidelight there. Law enforcement, national security, state and local. Oh my gosh, we're drawing lines between these things already with regard to cyber. How many Americans realize the limited authorities that the federal government has for law enforcement to begin with? And the ability the federal government has because of Watergate and the scandal of the 70s and the limitation placed upon our intelligence agencies. How many people realize the inherent limitations the federal government has? Well, those are being translated into the cyber world. Because people are concerned about the federal government's role. Well, who else is going to do it? I'll tell you who else is going to do it. The state and locals are going to do it. They have no restrictions like the federal government yet has, but yet we imagine ourselves, we, the federal government, the guys in Washington, is knowing all and being able to manage this entire thing. We don't have a clue. The state and local people are way ahead of us when it comes to putting together organized plans that actually work. Roles and missions. I'm going to tell you, as taxpayers, there are hugely expensive replications going on in our government right now as we speak. We have capabilities being duplicated in law enforcement agencies that are now extant only in the National Security Agency. We have whole plans to replicate and duplicate programs. Duplications in budgets are sometimes helpful, as I note, because we are able to discover weaknesses sometimes in new capabilities. Domestic foreign lines are also silly and dangerous, yet we're implementing these in our policy. I'm sorry, but the people who are doing, who are the seniors in cyber, most of them are not qualified to do this kind of work. They really aren't. If you look at their backgrounds, they shouldn't be in senior leadership positions, yet we got a lot of these guys who are doing it. I'm sorry, it's my opinion after spending 40 years in this business. Embedded capabilities. Who's in charge of this? What kind of technical exchanges are there among all the people involved in cyber? What kind of technical exchanges? You realize that most of the real intelligence breakthroughs and scientific breakthroughs that have really made difference in the national security of this country have come because of embedded capabilities and systems that we didn't realize until we started operating them. Oversight mechanisms. We need new ones. We need some old ones. Some of the old ones would work. What's the role of the Attorney General, for example? What are the roles of the various oversight committees? Okay, I'm going to hurry. I've been given them. Cyber is a hybrid area. Look at all the things that we should be thinking about. Yet you don't see references to these sort of things when you see people talking about cyber. SIGINT, ELINT, EW, EMP. Do you remember that? Do you remember the worry about EMP and all the work we did there? ComSec, InfoSec, the Atomic Energy Act. We created a whole infrastructure when we dealt with atomic energy back in the 1950s. Should we be thinking about doing that again? There's some pros and cons. FISA, Title 18, CALIA, USAT 18, of which I wrote a lot. AG procedures for the FBI, for all the agencies that collect information about U.S. persons. EO 12333. Section 14, that's the covert action part, and the equivalent part in 12333. Take a look at the DHS section 515, well worded. I'd like to meet the young staffer who wrote that. I know a staffer wrote it. that talks about the requirement for DHS to be situationally aware. And they wrote a privacy assessment statement, PSA, and you ought to go online and read it. It's a dramatically well-written document about what they see as important to us to get situational awareness of Homeland Security. I wish it had been written by their general counsel instead of their privacy officer. I wish it had been signed off by the Attorney General. I wish it had some more life to it than it has, but it's an extremely well-written document. How many Hansen and Ames cases do we remember? The 80s were the year of the spy. The disproportionate ability of a spy to go in and just tear us a new one with one of these little pocket doodads. I'm sorry, that's not. But we have a PFC who's doing who did a job on us there. Just imagine somebody who really wanted to do a job on us. Have we forgotten what we learned about counterintelligence? State and local authorities. Guess what? These guys are moving out, you know. We probably should be spending more time watching what they're doing, since we've been constrained as we have legislatively since the 70s with our limited role of law enforcement. Take a look at the executive order that creates something called the United States Center for Counterterrorism Communication over at the State Department. If you want to see something that you just want to tear your hair out when you read, it's a great expression of the frustration that we have between public affairs, information operations, and social media. There's this obsession in government to have the public affairs guys tell the truth. And we can't come to grips with the fact that we have to manage information today like we've never done it before. We have social media out there that are doing it for us if we don't do it. And all the intelligence agencies and even all the media were caught flat-footed by the Arab Spring. It's amazing. We have 5 countries that came unglued, freedom moments. We couldn't have done that with all the money we could have thrown at it. We couldn't have done it if we tried. It was done by kids talking on broadband. Thank you very much.
I'm going to try to referee now. Please, your questions. I'm sure there had to be some things that inspired some thoughts and questions, concerns. So, please, what would you like to ask our panel? Charles.
I'll start with
please.
one I can't give up on. Your last comment. Who did manage the Arab Spring? Surely it was not spontaneous.
Surely it was not.
Totally spontaneous. Who said what to whom in, of course, Arab media, social media, that generated this enormous, this fascinating, very important phenomenon? I've asked a lot of people that ought to know. Nobody seems to have noticed.
I'm aware of 2 DARPA projects right now, one funded and the other one.
No, not again.
No, seriously, one funded and one not funded. McBride, Dennis McBride is working with them. They're going to try and answer that question. That are looking into us being able to get our arms, get our head around this idea. Nixon said, when commenting about the CIA, it was 10,000 guys reading the newspaper. Well, 10,000 guys watching CNN, and the intelligence community pleads guilty about not knowing about this sort of thing. So, was it spontaneous? How long was it at work? Why didn't we know about it? We didn't have a clue. Well, the media didn't even have a clue.
Some media, be careful. Our standard media are just as blind as the rest of us.
Yeah.
But there are lots of people who are, and here the social networking is helpful.
Yeah.
Because there are lots of groups that talk to each other, but very privately, until you happen the right key to get into the right room in cyberspace, excuse me for the expression, nothing can happen. But we don't watch that, because that's not the official threat.
Why don't we?
Oh, I don't know.
Why don't we? The cyberspace is public, just like walking down the street with or taking a photograph.
It has a lot of hidden rooms.
You know,
Anyway,
but that technique that you're talking about right now, that is used extensively to protect our networks. There are cadres of people out there, and you've got to pay your dues to get inside of these networks. And they're out in front of the command and control structure right now. They're already writing scripts before they have told to write scripts. They're ad hoc in some cases. There's a core out there, and you've got to be able to deliver to that little core of people. If you're not value added to them, you're excluded. But those types of things are
I
working.
agree, and in that sense, I think what you were describing in terms of nobody's looking at ourselves, that was 10 years ago. That's really changed now.
I would just add one more thing too, Dave. There are people out there right now looking at our networks. There is a lot of that work that's going on. There's red teams and there's blue teams. Red teams will go out and find the problems. The blue teams will come in and fix the problems. That guy sitting over there, I believe, Jeff Hemler, didn't you organize the Marine Corps Reserve back in the late 90s to do some of that mission? So the Marine Corps, that's how one of the ways we use the Marines, go in there and test.
My point is we don't have our people that are the good guys going after. We have people that we've replicated. We're training people to do it. We're trying to train a domestic equivalent of the NSA to protect ourselves. I'm not sure that I as a taxpayer, I'm confident that my banking system or gas distribution system or that the ability to deliver parts for a defense production line is going to be protected. That was my point.
Sir, please.
Yeah, so you've all kind of talked about the situation, what's going on. Congress has had a number of hearings on this. There are a number of different pieces of legislation that are pending. Ultimately, they're going to do something, good, bad, or indifferent. So I'd be interested in your views. What should any ultimate congressional legislation include or not include to improve the situation as you see it?
Let me answer that. I worked on the Hill. I was general counsel for the Senate Intelligence Committee for a number of years, and I can tell you that Congress is in total disarray when it comes to cyber. Every committee who's got any equity whatsoever, and even those who don't have any equity whatsoever in cyber, have attempted to become relevant by introducing some kind of legislation that applies throughout the government until they learn, oh, well, wait a minute, maybe this is not the right thing to do. I'd say Congress is a long way away from doing anything competent with regard to cyber. It might do something just to be doing something because, as you know, the Congress competes with the executive branch for relevancy regardless of the politics, the party politics between the two. The president didn't want the Department of Homeland Security, for example. Opposed it, didn't want it, didn't want it, didn't want it. And the Department of Homeland Security has been viewed by the Congress as a vehicle to shovel jillions of dollars to their constituencies. Whether or not the Department of Homeland Security is effective or not to do the job that's outlined in its charter, I think there's no question about it. It's not, and it won't be for years. So you're asking the question that's a very sophisticated one. What can the Congress do? I think for the time being, the Congress ought to stay out of it until they, one, adjudicate their own custodial responsibility. They haven't even agreed among themselves what committees have what roles in the cybersecurity area. It's like watching the intelligence communities morph out of foreign affairs and justice and armed services as they did back in the 70s. And it's like watching the Homeland Security committees morph out of other committees as they did just a few years ago. But, listen, I think the Department of Homeland Security's primary job is to protect us from cyber attack domestically. Holy cow. We're in a lot of trouble. That's my view.
I think, last time I looked, I think I was told there's 22 pieces of legislation going back to maybe early July this year awaiting action up there, so I don't know where that goes. But I go back to my comments earlier before. I think there needs to be a mandate for some type of command and coordination or coordination control structure that where you do share information and you do a better job across the government. I can just see a major event happening and people having to sit up there looking up, explain why it happened. And, you know, Congress typically is looking in the rearview mirror, but I think that there should be a mandate for the executive branch to put together, tell them what the plan is that they're going to do to protect them. I don't see that coming. It's kind of peaks its way here and there, maybe in bits and grinds, but bits and starts rather. But I don't see any strong impetus to make. When I look at this, I kind of look at DoD, department, and everybody else, because we're much better organized than most other people. But what is the mechanism that is going to bring all of government together? And as I said before, you need to look at those mission-critical functions that the government performs and how is the executive going to fulfill the responsibility to protect those capabilities.
I would agree with that. It's an executive department responsibility. It should require an executive department assessment and some kind of adjudication that occurred like the DOE, DOD mandate that was worked out for nuclear power. That's a good example of the kind of thing that needs to be done. But we're not there yet. We're a long way from
We
that.
tend to think it's so close. Dick?
Well, let me make a few remarks. I mean, recalling my days working for the majority leader of the Senate, because Congress can be a very frustrating place. There was 535 prima donnas. If you don't count the other 5 who were delegates from our territory, so 540 of them. And they all are employed by the people of their district or their state. They don't work for the president. They don't work for us. They don't work, their power base is somewhere else. So the first thing I would say is it was meant to be a confusing place. I mean, that is the reality of what it's supposed to be, particularly on the House side. The Senate was supposed to be a little bit different, but since the 15th Amendment, it also is playing to the public. Go and look at the website of any congressman or senator, and you will see Representative Billy Bob introduced a bill about this. Representative Billy Bob introduced a bill about that. Well, what do you do to introduce a bill? Absolutely nothing. You send some kid on your staff down and you throw it into what's called on the House side, what's called the hopper, and he gets a number and you got a bill. That's it. So, you know, there's a lot of that playing to the grandstand to the extent that this is an issue. And it happened with terrorism. It happened before with nuclear weapons. You're going to get that. You're going to get people doing things. Now, the problem is, I think Churchill hit it on the head when he said democracy is a terrible system, except for all the rest that have been tried. You know, the problem is...
He also said the greatest argument against democracy is having, what, a 5 or 10 minute conversation with the average voter?
Yeah, but there you are. The problem is, every time anything else has been tried, it has ended up in absolute disaster. So you got the system, you got it. Now, I think what's missing here is there is no leadership. The leadership has got to come from, and it's not from an executive department. The leadership has got to come from the president on a new issue. You want to build an aircraft carrier, leadership comes from DoD. We know what aircraft carriers are. DoD has a process. They come in and say, this is what we need to do. And you can agree with them or not, but it comes from an executive department. You don't imagine the Department of Agriculture weighing in on this.
But when you're dealing with something new like this, you need leadership from the White House. There needs to be an articulated thing, and I will sum up to you what is wrong with what's going on in cyber right now, and it's called the health care bill. Now, you can laugh. What went wrong on the health care bill? It was thrown out as an idea and left to the Congress to draft it. You cannot ask 540 people to draft something. That's not even counting staff. You've got to have a sense of what you're doing. You've got to articulate a policy. You've got to submit something, and then you argue it through. It's messy. It's ugly. But it's got to be done that way. One more quote. Bismarck. If you like them, there are two things you must never watch being made. Sausages and laws.
Actually, he said policy. It's close enough.
Jamie, anything to add on that?
Well, I think they articulated it well. I mean, I will say this, I'll channel Admiral Mike McConnell, who said that we're probably not going to do anything effective until there is a major problem with cyber. And the government really won't be able to do it unless we really have one. But I will say this, too. I mean, if someone were actually taking out of our banks the physical money, the dollars and cents, the bills and the coins of the trillions of dollars in value that's actually already going out of this country, exfiltrated through cybercrime, we wouldn't stand for it. So the urgency is actually already there, absent the kind of doomsday that Admiral McConnell has said that we want. So I mean, it's urgent now. Kind of going along with what Dan said, one of the things I kind of get a front row seat is kind of the tension between the various committees, and I'm afraid that part of whatever the cyber legislation will come up with will have a lot to do with which committees get to retain oversight over which parts of cybersecurity, and I'm pretty sure that's not necessarily a major part of the solution. So it is of concern to me.
Jalen? I just make one. I tend to agree with what the ambassador said. But the president's not going to be the person that can do this on a day-to-day basis. And I've got a little bit of thought this, and this requires someone who's got tremendous prestige, tremendous stature across all of government and all the industry in the United States. There are not many people out there that's got that. Somebody that can manage and bring all these forces together. Because there are so many compartmented thoughts, the culture is so different. It almost takes a personality larger than life to manage this. And like I said, it's like a George Marshall with the Marshall Plan for the rebuilding of Europe. Somebody of that stature that has been empowered by the president, because the president's got so many other things on his plate right now. It takes that type of leader, and there are not many of them out there.
Ma'am, in the back.
Hi, I actually came here, I've worked 28 years in the Silicon Valley, so I kind of have an industry perspective. I came here a year ago to study IT policy at George Washington, among other things. And the thing I've learned is that the Valley doesn't care a whole lot about what's going on in Washington, and there's a real disconnect between the cultures. But the Valley is who innovates and who comes up with all kinds of ideas that the government just sort of spins their heads out after. And I'm just kind of wondering what you might see as a role for industry in taking up leadership, because the government's not going to solve this problem.
One of the challenges between what goes on in the Valley and what goes on inside the government is a lot of the technology that's out there is focused on sharing information and opening up, whereas the government's got stuff that is very sensitive, and they're trying to protect, and there's a dichotomy there, and the technology is not there to bridge that gap. Now, if they want to focus on developing the technology to allow that flow of information, I think you got a big winner there. That's my question.
You're too diplomatic. I think we're clueless, and absolutely clueless in this town. We really just don't have a clue, and it's just a shame.
Well, it's one of those people who must not have a clue. I would say this, from the FCC standpoint, and what we've dealt with for over 75 years now, the concept of network security and reliability of private companies. We are looking at what I think are some very innovative security aspects that could be, in essence, incorporated in by the carriers and by the internet service providers. So it's a private solution. So how do we facilitate that?
Exactly.
And so I mean, and I'm not endorsing it, but Telcordias, you know, the Chain Security. There are any number of startup companies, big, small. And so what do we do to provide kind of some of the things that from a regulatory standpoint, we might be able to create a market by saying, well, okay, carriers, internet service providers, you have to go get some. We don't care which ones. Go get one of those and make sure that your networks are secure.
Well, I mentioned that in my presentation. That's been our practice in the past. Look at Kalia. We're about ready to do it with the broadband again. We throw a lot of money. We have no way of knowing whether or not the intention has been carried out, or whether it's been carried out at all. When we went to look at the 1994, for example, we discovered that it wasn't carried out. We had to amend the law and to allow these new companies to hire, quote, trusted agents to do the part of the work that we had already given them money to do. So our obsession with private enterprise, particularly in our telecommunications and cyber infrastructure, is extremely inefficient.
Which is why you need
So,
performance measures.
you had a question here, Charles, and then I'll come back to you. Please.
Follow up on the Admiral's comments and comments to the other one. Kevin Imroth, the Center for Abstract Defense Studies at National Defense University. Given that 80 to 85% of the infrastructure you're talking about is in the private sector,
Right.
all of the equipment is manufactured in the private sector. You talked about nothing. How do you align the economic incentive for the private sector to increase security? At present, you know, there's really limited downside risk on the providers for having to secure the systems. There's no regulation or...
You would agree, would you not, that the 15% ought to be bulletproof, right?
You still have to make the 15%
There's no
bulletproof
such
because
thing.
it's not owned, because the supply chain isn't government. The government doesn't build it. The government just buys it. The government doesn't even mandate that you buy software that isn't filled with holes.
Should
The
the
supply
.gov
chain
be
is the
bulletproof?
vulnerability.
Anybody else want to respond to this? Dave?
Yeah, I mean, look, the percentages are new. You know, it used to be that what you were protecting was, I don't know what they were, but 75, 80% in the hands of the government. Armies, navies ran navy yards and ports and whatnot. And the civil population, the business and whatnot, was the minority share. Now that's kind of flip-flopped. That's absolutely right. But I don't know that the concept is all that different. The reality is, and I think we have to go back to your question too about the job of the government is to bring together, to aggregate the people's interest and to defend, in this case, defend the country. That is, it's interest articulation and interest aggregation. This is basic political science. And at some point, you have to bring those things in together, and the government has the powers to do those things. Now, the people, and businesses are people, have the ability to come back and say, no, you're not going to do that. You do that at the ballot box in the next election. If you do something that's totally unpopular, you get yourself unelected. But the reality is that's sort of how the system works. What can you do? Businesses are in business to make money. That was true in World War II if you ran a port or you ran a shipping line. It was true during the Cold War if you ran an airline and we had a Civil Reserve air fleet. It was always true. The job of the government is to say, but in certain circumstances that we will define, this is what has to be done. Now, you can do that by absolute regulation. It's not the best way, but it's the way the government likes to do it. You can do it through tax incentives. You can do it with various market bases. You can change the way things are done, the way business is structured, so that there's some incentive for companies to do certain things that you want them to do. But whichever way you choose, in the end, it comes down to a government articulating what must be done in the interest of the nation and telling businesses that this is how it's going to be done. Now, you can consult with them, you can be nice or you can be nasty, but the reality is, in the end of the day, private industry is going to have to be told, this is a critical infrastructure, and these are the things that are going to have to be done.
We don't allow people to sell bad meat. And we can't have bad
At least
computer
often,
systems.
we don't do it often.
Or cantaloupe.
Never often.
Hey, if I can bootstrap off of that, I think the master's exactly right. I mean, government has to fill any gaps that markets don't provide. So the example that I gave in my talk directly was border gateway protocols for security routing, preventing route hijacking. It apparently is not going to be something that the markets provide. And we've got over 10 years, maybe more than that you could say, that it's not been provided. So that may be one thing. Do you have to do that without outright regulation? Well, maybe not. Maybe you provide the incentives, and this is just a scenario, the FCC, who regulates most of these folks, says, let's sit down and talk about how we can move toward a collective action that all the carriers and internet service providers can move toward a secure border gateway protocol without regulation. And quite frankly, they would like to avoid outright regulation on it. But the thing, and this goes back to the previous question, is that you have to measure. There have to be some type of performance metrics on this. And if you don't, if we're not measuring up, we're not either making gains or moving forward on that, then you might have to have something that's a little bit more restrictive, as the ambassador mentioned, to make sure that we do move forward, whether that's supply chain, whether it's border gateway protocols, botnets, any of that number of things like that. That, I think, is the proper role of government. You certainly would want to go in that with the least restrictive means that is effective, but you have to have both of those parts of the equation.
If we're going to make a conscious decision that we're going to protect that 15%, that means we're going to have to get back into some of the businesses that we got out, like the foundries and things like that, where we built the secure chips,
Yes.
software assurance.
That is being looked at very
Charles?
carefully now, and it won't really help. No, the problem is much harder than we are admitting. There is no bulletproofing of anything. Start with that, Dan. Throw it overboard. It's a bad idea. It won't work.
How about that?
A corollary of that is there is no defense around the edges. It's got to be a defense in depth. Every step has to be covered. People know how to do that, but it's expensive and it is slow. Forget the click that gets you the answer in a tenth of a second. That's gone. It may take you minutes to do the number crunching to make it secure. It won't work, folks, the way we think. The major things that can be done, and I want to mention only one, that came up a number of times, and I want to kind of put out as maybe a post for the next meeting to hang on to. I've been in this business some decades now, and I co-chair the National Academy Committee on exactly the security issue. That was 15 years ago. And what was then considered as the most difficult problem is still unsolved. We do not have a clear and policy that can be implemented of retaliation. We know we have all kinds of ideas. We can do all kinds of things. If we can find the thing, we may be able to do something, no matter where it is. But the warning is maybe a few tenths of a second. It's not the flight time of a missile from A to B. Even if A is just across the street from B. It's very hard. And the thing that is missing is a presidential commitment. Dave was exactly right on that. That's missing in this country and everywhere else I know of, except maybe in the countries that are the bad guys, who have thought this through and decided which way to go. But that is not because I have it in for the president, but the White House his office is the only place where all the strands of power that are related to this issue come together. And that is by design of the founders. That's how they wanted it, because they were more afraid of a tyrant taking over than they were worried about defending against the British or the French. Now That was then, and this is now. So we need to think, and that's another topic I wish the Institute would take on in a serious way, in a creative way. What can we do? Now, I will only take one more paragraph. During nuclear emergency decades, which I lived through and was much involved, the president did pre-delegate to a general officer who was in an airplane that given, in the air, that given certain circumstances of very sure sign of an attack on the United States, that PG, bless his heart, had the responsibility and the authority to say, I'll send out the go code. Nobody knows this anymore. Forgotten, repressed. But it
became very
all the
routine,
same,
Charles.
and it was very important. And that's a way, a design point that we know has worked. That end of story.
You know, you're right. And when you look at the complexity of the whole issue, if you could change out every system in the DoD, as an example, today, by the time you got it all changed, it would take you how long? It would take you forever, right?
It would be obsolete.
That's exactly right.
It would be absolutely useless. It would not work with anything else.
And that's why,
that's why
there's got to be, I think there's got to be a risk management strategy that is adopted that helps us to deal with these different variables that are out there. And there are risk management strategies within the government, but the problem is they're not coordinated, they're different, they're almost like a Venn diagram. They got, you know, certain areas are covered, but as a whole, they just leave us wide open.
every skiff you go into has a Lenovo PC in it.
Congressman, you get the last question.
What concerns me in listening to everybody, and I think Charles is right, I don't think there's any guarantee that any piece of electronic hardware is secure. You can have a trusted component in what? In a legacy system? I think we're going to have to rethink the role of the internet. I'm a little concerned that the discussion is focused exclusively on what the government can do. This is a private sector issue. And this is candidly, I think, a reflection of Washington culture. That we,
that's unrealistic. What do you mean what's the private sector going to do about this? Compare this to European.
I think there's a reason the Russians use these teams and these outside entities because, frankly, they know what they're doing. And I don't think we have a comparable level of expertise in the government. We have a lot of individuals, and I've talked to a lot of them, who have a very good handle on the problem. And everybody that I've talked to, in and out of the intelligence community or in the national security community, is scared to death of what is going on and the government's inability to act.
So you're not talking about the corrective action for cybersecurity? Well, being private sector responsibility, are you?
I'm saying that, to give a specific example, I've been very involved in some discussions relating to the DIP. Or you hear the term public-private partnership. Let me put a Washington spin on what it means to have a public-private partnership. It means that the government wants to pretend it's in charge, and generally the private sector participants are there for marketing opportunities, not necessarily security. And in my view, let's get, the discussion has been, that I hear, and I don't mean this necessarily with respect to you, every one of the presentations has been great. But if you look at security theory, and I'm coming from the perspective of being a lieutenant and being in the Philippines and learning how to set up defensive lines, you deal with the threat. We're not addressing security to the threat, we're addressing security to the government. We're focused on the process, not the problem. And the problem, reduced to its core essence, is a 4-second problem, or in the event of an attack, maybe a 4-millisecond problem. you have to pre-think how you're going to respond, how you're managing, how you're monitoring the data, how you're handling your security. By the way, your best algorithm may have a shelf life of 4 weeks. That really fits nicely into a 3 to 5 year procurement system.
Right.
Okay, and you know, I just think we got to get back to core principles. This has been a great presentation, and I appreciate the chance to set the stage for people to go get beer.
And I agree with what you're saying, and that's part of the command or coordination control, whatever you call it. You know, when you're buying different systems at different rates of time, they tend not to work together real well. You don't have the ability to do, you know, you're talking about 4 millisecond delay. Well, just to go through 2 or 3 parts of the network, and there may be 1,000 pieces to the network, you've probably used up 3 or 4 seconds right there because of the way it's designed. This was never designed to do what we're asking
Well,
it to do.
and I'll just offer one other thought that ties into this. If you read the history, when our founders created the Constitution, we had roughly 200 to 250 years of solid experience with the technology of printing. If I'm not mistaken, the word process originated from the fact that you could print. You could write things down, you could prescribe how people would behave. And they had, in my view anyway, a very shrewd understanding of how the technology of information sharing, committees of correspondence, the post office, Franklin's efforts from an early days of intelligence, but how paper was a function within the culture of our society. And they were brilliant in addressing how a structure could relate to the way people really live in the culture. In the last 30, 40 years, we've totally turned our way of communicating with each other upside down, and yet we're still taking this 17th and 18th century structure and frankly trying to squeeze solutions into it. And I don't think we can do it. It's going to really, I think Charles is dead right. It's absolutely going to require some serious thinking. And incrementally, the problem I see with the government is it's very rare, it does exist in certain sectors, but it's very rare to get somebody with the ability to make a decision on that 4-second problem. And in the private sector, you've got different legal principles that apply, including the right of self-defense. You know, there's also civil liability issues. For instance, if the Congress would, rather than telling industry what to do, would institute some liability standards, I think you'd find the private sector would move very quickly to adapt to the problem. And so what I'm trying to say is it's a lot more complicated than we may necessarily appreciate.
Thanks. Jamie, well, any closing comments? We'll go across the table from one end to the other.
Okay, just quick, and I'll read the Congressman's, I mean, just to be clear, and I can't stop, believe me, I cannot speak for the entire part of the government, but from an SEC standpoint, we do see, I mean, it's a private sector. I mean, you talk about attack, we're under attack right now. Who's handling it? Private companies are handling it. So the real question is, Governor, is where can the private companies who have a problem, because there are competitors in working together, where does who gets it together? And really that I think is a proper role for government, and it's one where we need to act. But what the understanding is, at the end of that action, it's still going to be the private companies that are on the front line of resisting those attacks.
General Shea.
One of my biggest concerns is that we have people making decisions that really don't understand the totality of the complexity of what's going on. So we try to take the complexity out of the issue, and we lose a lot in the transition there. The other thing is culture plays an incredible piece to all of this. Culture is the most difficult thing to overcome, I think. The technology can be made available if the culture is allowed to, if the culture shifts to accommodate it. But a lot of our problems can be solved with some culture shift, and that's not going to happen without this leadership that I talked about. I just don't know where that is going to come from. And when I look at the networks and the ones that I've worked with and the ones I've installed, operated, maintained, all those things, there is, when you look at the enormity across the government and commerce, and you look at the different versions and generations, when we talk about gaps and seams, there's a lot of gaps and seams. If you, as we were saying, if you could feel a system tomorrow, by the time you got to feel it, it would be years, and the vulnerabilities would, there'd be new vulnerabilities you have to deal with. Okay. So it's risk management, it's an approach we got to get smart on.
Well, first of all, Jim, thanks very much. Those are very useful comments. I would simply say that, you know, in a million years of human history, we've never, no culture has overcome itself. I mean, the reality is, you have to work with the culture you got. The culture we have is the one that has this political system. Maybe nobody in Washington knows what they're doing, but that is part of the culture too. So, you know, here we are. The government's got to pull this together. Jim, I think you're absolutely right. Yes, maybe the companies would do things if you fixed some of the liability issues. But even that I would call is, I mean, in a sense, that's a market solution. That's something the government has to do to create the laws for the companies to operate that way. Companies are not going to do anything that does not bring in money. That's what they're required to do. That's what the CEO is hired and fired to do. That is what the board of directors demands. So they're going to protect themselves if you give them that incentive, if you change the liability structure, and then it becomes more profitable to defend yourself than to not defend yourself, they will do that. But they're not going to start doing things just for the heck of it. They're not going to. That's the government's job to articulate that and to create the structure for that. And that requires leadership. And I'm absolutely, and when I say leadership from the White House, I do not mean this president. This did not start here in this administration. I'm not giving good or bad marks to this president or the previous one, but the reality is there needs to be some leadership. Let me just say something about whether it's 4 seconds or 4 milliseconds. It doesn't matter. There is no human-in-the-loop system that's going to react in 4 milliseconds or 4 seconds, or frankly 40 seconds or even 4 minutes. You know, that's about 4 minutes is about where you might be able to get some kind of a human-in-the-loop thing. But you then have to create structures to deal with that. And some of this is going to have to be resilience. We are not going. We've got to get away from this fortress mentality that we're going to block everything. We're going to take some of these hits, and the question is, how do you deal with those hits? You know, you need that elastic. You have to do this. This is not American football. It's European football. You can't just create a line. You're going to fall back. You're going to do a rotation, and you're going to counterattack. And that's. And I think we got to get into that mode. You keep hearing we're going to get out ahead of this cyber threat. No, we're not going to get out ahead of it. We need to deal with it.
Dan, last word.
Just a simple thought. It unfortunately is going to require a significant event for us to do anything. And the government will have to do what it always does. 9/11, Pearl Harbor, you know, have to simulate wisdom and do something that it probably should have done before the event. But that's just the way it works. It's going to require, unfortunately, a significant cyber event. And the only question is, and we're totally at the mercy of those decision makers external to our borders as to when or whether that should occur and the nature and extent of it, the severity of it. As I said in my slides, I think the only thing that saves us right now is that they have to consciously weigh the cost of this source of unbridled intelligence and information, as opposed to shutting down a significant part of it. And it really boils down to somebody else's decision. But it'll happen, I guarantee you, it will happen.
Thank you. You know, in 1807, Robert Fulton was credited with inventing the first steamship. And legislation was slow to catch up, and the policies. In 1865, the Sultana, with a capacity of 347 on that steamship, had over 2,400 loaded, and it blew up, and over 1,800 men died. Worst maritime disaster in our nation's history, 300 more than the Titanic. Between the period of 1831 and 1838, 1 senator and 3 congressmen died because of being on steamships and then blowing up.
We've seen policy take a long time to develop. We've seen people drag their feet or argue or chew on these difficult things. Does it take that big event? Yes, there was another one in New York City, I think in 1904, where over 1,000 women and children on a steamship in New York City. Then President Teddy Roosevelt just started firing people, raised the roof, and that was one of the big culminating events. Then we got into motorboats, 1910, legislative started with that. So if we're looking for the panacea of a perfect policy, this has been addressed, you know, where are we, what does it take, and how do we get there? I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our panel members for their thoughts, and let's hit the beer, wine, cheese, and assorted fruit over there. My thanks is the only thing stopping you from getting there, so a round of applause, please.